Now, it's time for the Anchormen podcast with Matt Gaetz and Dan Ball. Welcome back to another episode of our show, Anchormen, and I am joined today by a real expert in what's going on around the world. Glenn Greenwald is one of the original founders of The Intercept and now is the host of System Update on Rumble. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me. I want to cover what's going on in a lot of different places, but really I wanted to begin with how you view just the Trump doctrine as we encounter it in this second term, because it does feel like it has a different energy than we had in Trump 1, with people like Mattis and Tillerson having a real large role in the shaping of that policy. Now it seems very, Howard Lutnick, Scott Bessent, Donald Trump, it's economic engagement driven. But how would you describe, I guess, that difference and then the Trump foreign policy doctrine as we encounter it in 2025?
Yeah, there's no question that the Trump administration in its current iteration 2.0 is very different in a lot of ways than the first iteration. I think there are a lot of ways in which that's a good thing. I heard from the Trump campaign, people close to the Trump circle, all throughout 2024 and into the transition, that they believe, and I totally agree, that one of the big problems with the first administration was that so many people had infiltrated it, had contaminated it, who pretended to be on board with the America First ideology, but in fact were sworn enemies to it and were really there to undermine and subvert everything he was doing. And I think they got away with that because he was very new to Washington. He had never been in an elected office before. A lot of people surrounding him didn't really understand Washington maybe as well as they should have. I mean, he was relying on Jared Kushner and his daughter. And I think they did, in a lot of ways, subvert what he was doing. And they were determined not to let that happen again. And they clearly came in prepared to ensure that Trump is the leader of the administration. He gives the orders and people carry it out. They selected people who were willing to do that. So we actually have an elected president who's making decisions for the executive branch, which I personally think is good. I think it's pretty dangerous when you have, generals and other national security officials just going off on their own, doing what they want and even violating orders of the president. I think the problem, Matt, is that, the reason I was so interested in the Trump campaign beginning in 2016, despite it causing a lot of kind of rifts with a lot of former viewers and readers of mine, was because of the America First ideology, which I took seriously. The idea that, look, it's time to prioritize American citizens and their interests, which should be pretty basic, but it hasn't been, which means battling big corporate power, big banks, big multinational corporations, instilling the notion that we have an industry in the United States, that we have jobs in the United States, but also that we're not going to go to war for or continue to finance the wars of foreign countries. I mean, this was so central, for me at least, in terms of what the promise of the Trump ideology has been. And in so many ways, we're seeing so many violations of that, particularly in foreign policy, but also it's spilling over in a lot of ways into domestic policy, free speech as well.
And there was the moment when he wins the South Carolina primary back in 2016 where the veil is pulled back on this theory that Republican operatives and Republican candidates have been told that you have to support this Liz Cheney version of foreign policy in order to have any credibility. Otherwise, you're an outcast. You're someone that is derided regularly. And Trump stood up and called George W. Bush a war criminal and walked in and won South Carolina. And that was that, and it was a remarkable reshaping. But one of the reasons that condition you described of infiltration occurred is this highly intricate credentialing system that interventionists have developed in Washington, D.C. And I never understood it until I got there and really started to pay attention, but so much money is spent on these think tanks to get people, vice president of public policy for Eurasia titles, and to endow professorships where people could say, oh, there I was at, Georgetown or some other, the School of Foreign Service, and develop this lecturing credential. And when you weigh that against the life experiences of a lot of people who are foreign policy realists, it gets challenging. And that weighed heavily on the first Trump term. I think people saw through that really effectively on a lot of fronts this last go around. but it is a condition we still encounter. What do you think the antidote is to that? There are all these Wilson Center and type entities that do such a good job credentialing. But if someone thinks thoughtfully about maybe wanting to reserve America's focus to America's interests, they don't get those opportunities.
Yeah, that's why it's so important and so interesting to speak to somebody who was in the kind of bowels of Washington as you were and got there with a certain set of ideas about how Washington works and then actually saw the real way that it works and are willing to speak openly about it. It's not that common. I think the whole world of think tanks, it's so opaque and mysterious to most Americans, never think about think tanks, don't really care about think tanks, when it's such a crucial part of the incentive scheme in Washington. I remember when Nikki Haley resigned from the Trump administration as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in the first Trump term, and she got extremely rich in the immediate aftermath of that. So made something like $8 million, paid off a lot of debt she was in. And we investigated, like other journalists did, to find out how she was making that money. And one of the major ways was that she got hired by think tanks who are funded massively by huge pro-Israel interest, pro-war interest, the kind of people who just want, who get appointed into key positions, whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. They have kind of a shadow government. And so it's a two-way system. On the one hand, they do a very good job because of how much money they have in being able to sort of attract the people who seem to Washington lawmakers or White House officials like they're the real experts, and they're only there because of their shared ideology, this sort of bipartisan consensus that they believe in. And then there's also a second incentive, which is, that if you leave government or you leave Congress, as long as you did your service and served that agenda, there's all kinds of sinecures waiting for you where you can get very rich by doing that. And, I think on the one hand, there's all this progress that has been made in breaking this, decades-long bipartisan consensus that has been so detrimental to our country. The rise of independent media has obviously been crucial. The fact that there are all kinds of members of Congress now on both the left and the right who are deviating from it and making the case for it. There's obviously a left and right anti-establishment furor of the kind that I don't think we have seen for decades in the United States. The problem, though, and it's so true, is if you look at Washington, the two parties in Congress still basically work more or less the same way. They're really not responsive to these changes in public opinion. And that's because what official Washington has is this kind of locked-in system to force people to serve the agenda of moneyed interest in Washington and really not very much listen to or care about the actual constituents who elected them.
Yeah, it is a binary test. Are you willing to go along with the grift? And if you're willing to go along with the grift, then that presents in a variety of forms. You're willing to go say that bills do things that they don't actually do. You're able to kind of falsely avoid blame on things like spending. You're able to take these just bogus intel briefings they give you and then walk out acting like you've seen the Rosetta Stone. And if folks go along with that, you're right. There's a very lucrative incentive structure. One member told me who had played the game and got a sweet gig that being a fellow with a think tank as a former member of Congress was just like being a congressman, but you make 4 times the money. Because you have a big staff that's paid for, you get all your travel expenses paid, you go around giving interesting speeches to people who want to hear you talk, you give media interviews, and instead of making, $1.72, you can make $600,000. And so many of them do. And then what that means is those folks own them in the short term. And I'll put it this plainly, if you did not have defense contractors, the interests of foreign governments, and a select group of Fortune 100 corporate interests, think tanks wouldn't even be a thing. You wouldn't even know about them. You would never hear about them. But now they are providing this faux credentialism and also a lot of grass tops imagery around support for U.S. intervention in a variety of these conflicts. So the first one I want to talk to you about, obviously, is in Gaza, where Israel is now saying they want to occupy Gaza, which is the most predictable thing after the way they have waged this war. But is it wrong, Glenn, that there's a part of me that's like, you know what? You guys want to go be an occupying force? Take the baton and freaking run with it, because we have endured that in the early aughts in Iraq and Afghanistan to tragic consequences. Even Russia got the heck out of Syria. You had Iran pulling back from some of their proxy forces. So if Israel wants to go be the neighborhood crime watch of Gaza City, like the block captain of Gaza, won't they kind of get their punishment just from the nature of that experience, or is it going to have to come with all of this shame over the atrocities that people have witnessed?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's a big question. I mean, I would look at it differently, perhaps, if it weren't for the fact that the United States government and therefore American workers and American taxpayers were going to pay for the whole thing. We send $4 billion a year minimum automatic to Israel in a deal negotiated by President Obama on his way out in 2016 with Netanyahu. It's a 10-year deal, so it's going to be up for renewal in 2026. I'm sure that number is going to increase. But then on top of that, we send billions and billions and billions more. We send $17 billion extra every time Israel decides they want a new war. And on top of that, we deploy our own military assets and put our service members in harm's way in that region to protect Israel as well from the anger that they're provoking. And so the cost to the United States and American taxpayers is so massive. And if they go and occupy Gaza, they can't do that without us paying for it. And of course, we're going to end up paying for it. Trump has pretty much made that clear. Now, having said that, I think it is interesting to note that the most vocal opponents of this new plan to go and occupy Gaza, and it's really not a new plan. If you listen to Israeli leaders from the start after October 7th, the hostages and dismantling Hamas, these were pretexts. That's their WMD, their 9/11 attack. The real goal that they always had was a lot of them believe in the idea that Gaza and the West Bank belong to Israel, even though the entire international community is against that. The U.S. government's position for decades has been, we want a two-state solution. That's no longer a possibility. They want to move those people in Gaza out, the Palestinians and the Muslims and the Arab Christians, and replace them with Jews, with Israeli Jews that are going to rule that region as well as annex the West Bank. That was always the plan. But the interesting thing is it's the IDF, like the generals and the IDF officials who are saying, if we go in and occupy Gaza, first of all, it's going to be a death trap. You can occupy it, but there's still Hamas there. There's armed people there. They're obviously going to fight a guerrilla war like we saw in Iraq, and they're going to have to deal with that for years. And then on top of that, there's no plan. Like, what are you going to do with the people that there's still, well, there was 2.2 million people when this began. Maybe there's 1.8, 1.9 million now. So you're right. If they do that, they're going to be probably harming themselves. But the thing that I worry about, Matt, is that, they have demonstrated that they have no regard for life of the people in Gaza. They don't see Gazans or Palestinians more broadly as human. The number of deaths and the starvation has demonstrated that. And obviously, if they go in and occupy, it's going to entail massive amounts of more death. They're going to just be killing randomly because they are going to be in danger, IDF soldiers, and they're already fighting multiple front wars for several years now. Huge numbers of them have PTSD. A lot of them won't go back to fighting. It's an army that has really been put through the ringer, and to ask them now to govern Gaza the way the United States had to govern, Fallujah and the Sunni Triangle and all the places in Iraq for all those years, you're right. I mean, that is not in Israel's interest, but I worry more about the impact on the United States and Americans as well.
The way those funding battles work in Congress is just debasing for so many of these folks who represent districts that are poor, that need their Congress member to care about them. And the way we do this with some of these touchstone international issues, Glenn, like I was shocked. Like there was a time period where every week we had to pass another resolution about the Uyghurs. And I don't mean to say that their plight is not a meaningful one, but it just felt like incessant. And then with Israel, there was a time period where almost every day we were passing a different version of a condemnation of the BDS movement. And I don't know. I'm not a fan of the BDS movement. I don't want to participate in it. But did Mike Huckabee become the leader of it when they tried to shut down the Zionist Christian tours? Because I saw these statements from Mike Huckabee where they're shutting down the Zionist Christian tours with this Jewish supremacy ideology. And he says that the way he's going to react is that Christians should no longer plan to Israel. They should boycott their plan to Israel. That American donors should stop funding groups in Israel, so divest, and then he was going to withhold sanction, or he was going to sanction by withholding the visas of people in Israel who wanted to come to the United States. So, like, what chapter of the book are we in when Israel loses Mike Huckabee?
Well, and also, the Israeli military murdered an American citizen in the West Bank, as they do with quite a lot of frequency. And Mike Huckabee actually denounced that vehemently and called it a terrorist act, which obviously is a word that typically only gets applied to Israel's enemies and not to Israel. It was really the settlers who did the murders, but the IDF is there to back them up, and there's no accountability. But the thing is, Matt, like, this is what I think is, I'm kind of amazed at what I'm seeing, even though on the in one way, I also don't find it surprising because of everything we're discussing. This is a movement, the Trump movement, that decided to call itself America First. And the argument was that we have been financing and funding and arming wars all over the globe that really don't have anything to do with us. And as a result, we need to reprioritize how we work in Washington so that the American people and their communities that are falling apart and our industry that has been, deindustrialized all throughout the country, and fentanyl and immigrants and all the problems that are making the United States fall apart, we need to focus on that instead. And now you have the summer recess in Congress, which, well, we can get into why if you want. There's the recess. I'm sure you've covered this. But I don't know if you saw, you probably did, but like 30 members of the House Republican Caucus, usually the summer recess is, the idea of it is you go back to your district, since none of them barely have anything to do with their district. So it's like one time they get to go back, touch the ground there. They have town hall meetings. They hear from their constituents about what they're thinking, about what they want. It's sometimes even raucous because people are upset, and that's an important thing for them to go to hear. They got on a plane on an AIPAC organized and paid for journey to Israel. And that's how they're spending their recess. It's like, and there's statistics that show that members of Congress make pilgrimage to Israel more than every country in Europe and Africa combined. They're constantly in Israel. And, I think we're also getting to the point now where a lot of people are starting to ask, like, wait a minute, we were promised America first. Why is every politician that I'm listening to constantly in Israel?
The leadership pushes you. I'll tell you why. I went on that AIPAC trip. I went on subsequent trips. And there is an actual downward pressure from the leadership and even the committee chairs. Like, if you're on the Foreign Affairs Committee, if you're on the Armed Services Committee, if you're on the Intelligence Committee, there's like an expectation that you go there in some sort of like, I don't know, congressional Hajj. And I remember being I'll never go back. I was at the King David Hotel, and I rolled back to my room unexpectedly when the rest of the group was still on some planned activity. And there was some dude in my room. I'm like, hey, man, what are you doing here? And he acted like he was associated with the hotel and taking an inventory, but had no clipboard. And so, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why they want members of Congress over there. And it is ideologically to steep them in this notion that the protection of Israel is of great import to people in America. But it's really not that important to voters, and that is becoming more clear on the right and left. So, like, we've talked about the actual policy. Let's just get into the raw politics. I maintain that the true legacy of Netanyahu is that during his control of Israel, he has successfully made this a politically divisive issue on the American right and left. And, like, when I was growing up, it was a pretty bipartisan thing to have people generally supportive of a friendly relationship between the United States and the only democracy in the region. And now on the left, it is a major issue in primaries. Do you think it will be on the right? And like, are we in the cycle where in 2028, maybe on the Republican stage, maybe on the Democrat stage, maybe both, like, you're going to see definitively anti-Israel candidates running for president saying, nominate me to lead this party, and I won't make us subservient to Israel. And nobody else on the stage will say that. Like,
it has to happen, Matt. It has to happen. I mean, I'd like to see what happens if anybody who says that actually gets close to the presidency in the United States. There are going to be a lot of very powerful interests who are going to be very frightened if that happens. But the reason why I say this has to happen is because the polling data that you reference is extremely clear. Every single demographic group in the United States has now, as a majority, views Israel unfavorably, except for conservatives over the age of 50 or Republicans over the age of 50, which they're still clinging on to this sort of, they've been indoctrinated going back to the Cold War about Israel. But young conservatives in particular are the steep downward is very, very steep. It's the incline downward. And you're obviously seeing major, major voices in the conservative movement, in the Trump movement, Marjorie Taylor Greene being one, you being another, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, Steve Bannon. I could go on and on and on. You even have people at the Daily Wire now, like when the Israelis attacked a Catholic church, on purpose, saying, wait a minute, like, I'm going to get off this train now. So there's only so long that you can sustain a gigantic breach in public opinion on the one hand and what the members of Congress do, and especially in a primary where if you have growing sentiment that I wouldn't even call it anti-Israel, I would call it more like opposed to the idea that we're supposed to be tied at the hip to this foreign country. And, younger conservatives have not been steeped in this. Israel really hasn't been talked about for the last 10, 15 years. This is really the first time a lot of people are getting a look, not just as Israel, but at how the U.S. serves Israel. And it's really a shocking thing. People are watching babies blown up every day, babies starving, and the Israelis doing what they're doing in Gaza, but also bombing Lebanon and Yemen and Syria, and then cajoling us into helping them bomb Iran. It seems like it's the only thing that the DC class talks about. And as a Jew, I actually do worry about how this is going to spark anti-Semitism in the sense that people are going to start to wondering, like, why is our government so controlled? Why is it so dedicated to this one country? And then also, I just want to say, Matt, because in some ways, this is the most important thing to me. As you know, I was very vocal in denouncing big tech censorship, Biden administration censorship. I absolutely supported the lawsuit to sue the Biden administration to bring it to the Supreme Court that it was a full frontal assault on the First Amendment to coerce and threaten big tech companies to remove dissent on COVID, Ukraine, the 2020 election. It's why I'm at Rumble, because they're a free speech platform. But what we're seeing now is a full frontal assault on free speech in defense of Israel. I mean, the Trump administration is demanding a radical expansion of hate speech codes to wildly expand what anti-Semitism is under this new definition called the International Holocaust Remembrance Act, so that now
definition
on
is
major college
bonkers.
campuses,
that definition is totally bonkers. That definition,
you cannot. You're barred from saying. Listen, this is a Trump presidency that was devoted to restoring free speech and opposing censorship. You are now barred from saying that you think that what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is similar to what the Germans did in World War II. You can say that about any other country. You can compare the United States government to Nazism. You can compare any other any other country you want on the earth. Just you cannot say it about Israel. You cannot say that you think Israel is a intrinsically racist endeavor because it's built on the idea of Jewish supremacy. You can call the United States racist because it, genocided Native Americans or whatever, or slavery. You're free to say that about your own country. You just can't say that about this, or China. You can say it about Iran, Peru, Indonesia, whoever you want, just not about Israel. And you can also not say that you believe that the Bible teaches that the Jews played a major role in the death of Christ, which is a teaching that many, many Christians for 2 centuries now have believed. I'm not saying you have to agree with any of those views, but how can you be banned, punished? How can this be off limits? You'll be fired if you're on the faculty. You'll be expelled if you're a student for expressing any of those views. There's a stranglehold on free speech in the name of this foreign country, not even to protect our own people, but in the name of protecting this foreign country.
When I was trying to get senators to vote to confirm me, they were giving me heat on this because I voted against some adherence in the House to this definition for those reasons you just laid out. Not because I want to give any comfort to the anti-Semites, but because we've just gone through what we've gone through with the Biden administration, where they get an inch and take a mile on censorship. And you look at a definition like that, and it's almost meme-ish. You're like, oh, well, how many products made in Israel do I need to have in my house to prove that I am not a boycotter? What is a sufficient amount of lamb's blood to paint on the door with my allegiance to Israel. And I'm sitting here getting grilled by the senator on this, who ultimately said they would have voted to confirm me. But I'm thinking to myself, who is having you ask these questions? Like, you from some Midwestern state where this can't be like central to what your constituents want in an attorney general, but it is so in the forefront of their mind. And I'll conclude our discussion on the Israel thing with this. You can't have this kind of a disconnect where the political representatives are so beholden to an ideology or any viewpoint that is becoming increasingly toxic to the body politic at an exponential rate. This system will not allow that to hold, and you will start to see people emerge and say, vote for me because I will not betray you in this way. And when that happens, I think that, like Glenn said, some really powerful people are going to be pretty nervous about it. One of my other favorite things to talk about is the Russia hoax. I really feel like I peaked during the Russia hoax. And I remember those days where Paul Ryan and Trey Gowdy were telling us to trust Robert Mueller. We should just hope Donald Trump hadn't committed any crimes. And if people just started to ask kind of basic questions about the Russia hoax, like, well, where did this dossier come from? And how are the mechanisms of intelligence collection being validated? If you ask those questions, it was like, you're Vladimir Putin's lawyer, you're a traitor to the country. And now, I mean, I think history is going to reflect on this and say, you had this batch of people in the Obama administration that were very dedicated to the Russia hoax, before and after they ever found the first fact that could have been tied to it. And then, you had a reckoning thereafter where during the Trump administration, some people who hadn't spoken up previously feel like they've got enough of a yellow brick road to have their views platformed with their criticism of that effort. I think that's kind of how it washes. But what's just crazy is the way those of us who ask questions were vilified. Like, you were among those voices. How do you bring the new revelations into perspective?
I think the new revelations are helpful to make people who still have residual doubts about whether RussiaGate was a gigantic fraud and hoax perpetrated by the CIA and the FBI to manipulate our elections. It's now a little bit easier to convince more people that there's no doubt that that's exactly what happened, that the CIA and the FBI manufactured a complete lie and then fed it to the Washington Post and the New York Times and NBC News, and they gave themselves Pulitzers for it and celebrated themselves, and it led to a special counsel. But, Matt, the thing is, like, you could tell from the beginning the whole thing was a fraud. It never made any sense. Why would the Kremlin have to conspire with Donald Trump and his campaign officials to hack into the DNC and Podesta's email in order to give them to WikiLeaks and have stuff that's incriminating about Hillary Clinton be published? Why couldn't they just do it on their own? There was also never any proof that Putin ordered it, that he did it in order to help get Donald Trump elected. Nobody thought Donald Trump had a chance against Hillary Clinton. And so there was all this huge evidentiary holes in it from the start, on top of which the way the story was being presented to the American public is exactly how so many lies got disseminated to the public. So many other times, the CIA and the FBI whisper to their favorite servants at the Washington Post and the New York Times, demanding anonymity, which they then get. The things they want the American people to hear, the Washington Post, the New York Times, NBC News, they all go around repeating it. And especially because they were so unified in their hatred of Trump, they were absolutely determined to have this be the thing that destroys him. And no evidence is needed by any of these so-called journalists. When journalistic skepticism of the CIA and the FBI is as foundational to being a journalist as you can possibly get, they had none of it. And it wasn't just this time, so many other times as well. But the other thing, Matt, is that the whole conspiracy theory from the start was basically composed of two claims. One, that Trump officials conspired, colluded, and collaborated with the Kremlin to break into the emails of the DNC and John Podesta. And then the other one was, even more important, I think, to this conspiracy theory, was that Vladimir Putin had blackmail power over Donald Trump, sexually, financially, personally, as Nancy Pelosi would always say. And as a result, if Donald Trump got elected, it would basically be Putin who was running our country. Okay, that was the core conspiracy theory. Trump gets into office, and the two policies that he implements toward Russia are, number one, to flood Ukraine with lethal offensive arms, which Obama didn't want to do, but Trump was pressured to do it to prove he wasn't a Russian agent. He flooded Ukraine with offensive arms, like the most threatening thing you could do to Russia. And then number two, he set out to destroy Nord Stream 2, which was the basis of future Russian economic prosperity. It enabled them to sell cheap natural gas to Germany and then to Europe. And Trump told Europe, if you keep buying gas through Nord Stream 2 from Russia, we're not going to pay for your defense. You have to buy it from us. Why should we pay? So basically, Trump attacked the national security of Russia and the financial prosperity of Russia, and not one journalist ever stopped to think, how do I reconcile with the claim that he's captive to Russia, that he's controlled by Russia? And finally, I will just say that on this core conspiracy of, that Trump or his son or his family or his key campaign officials conspire with the Russians, they set out. They unleashed Robert Mueller, who they said was the greatest and most honorable prosecutor ever to exist. He had a so-called dream team of prosecutors, unlimited resources, unlimited subpoena power. They unleashed him for 18 months. It drowned our politics in this conspiracy theory. He comes back, closes his investigation without indicting even one American for collaborating with Russia, and then writes a report saying, I looked, but I did not find any evidence establishing this link between the Russians and Trump in order to interfere in the 2016 election. And to this day, if you go and ask the New York Times, the Washington Post, they'll say, no, this wasn't debunked. This is absolutely true. And they're running cover now to try and claim that Tulsi's documents that she released, that she declassified, even though they obviously fortify the fact that it's a hoax. No, you're misreading them. They're fake, whatever. They're so invested in this fraud that they perpetrated. So yeah, I think the disclosures help, but RussiaGate really is and was a religion to the corporate media and to liberal America, and I don't ever see that being really changed.
Well, and the media played their role in information laundering because they're not going to be critical of what they're fed if they're just so hungry to be fed anything, right? There's an ecosystem where they're all there, frothing for information from these intel officials who, by the way, a bunch of whom they want to go work for these media companies afterwards. So that incentive structure.
They did.
Yes.
They did.
I know. It is the exact same dynamic we just described on the think tanks and members of Congress with the intel officials and then the frothing media entities that are engaged in this information spin up. And what regular folks that are upset about this want to know is when someone getting thrown in jail, which is a very challenging prosecutorial decision you got to make based on the likelihood of a conviction. And what for you to get kind of the actualization where more people do in fact acknowledge what this was, even if at the time they were bamboozled, you have to have a narrator. And that narrator can't be Director Gabbard, as good a job as she's done. You have to have the person on the inside explaining how this occurred. And based on the documents that CIA Director Ratcliffe and DNI Gabbard have released, those people do exist because they keep referencing these career folks. But if we have to hear that narrator, forget the bloodlust of whether you want to see people behind bars. Is that better done in a courtroom or in a congressional hearing? If we think about how both have been used to create a historical reckoning, where does Glenn Greenwald want to see the best narration we have of the worst features of this hoax?
In a perfect world, which is not the world we live in, if you are inside the national security state and the intelligence community and you purposely abuse the basically unlimited powers that they have to interfere in an American election, to manipulate the electorate, to try and get your colleague Hillary Clinton elected to the presidency and destroy the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency, I do think those ought to be crimes that people are held accounted for legally. The problem is we've created so many barriers and impunities and immunities for people who work in the intelligence community I thought, Bush officials should have been prosecuted for authorizing warrantless spying on American citizens in violation for the law, but everyone agreed, no, we can't do anything like that, or for torture. There's so many different layers of protections that these people have, and there's statute of limitations issues. So I agree that it's both unlikely, and the problem is if you didn't have an extremely strong case legally or factually, you risk vindicating these people if you can't overcome the gigantic hurdle of reasonable doubt in order to get a conviction, and that would end up having the opposite effect. So I agree with you totally. The way to do this is to get people, the Republicans control the Congress, get people who are both the wrongdoers, but then also people inside these agencies who will tell the story of what they understand and what they know, and that will bring a lot more public attention to it as well. And to that, I agree with you totally. Someone credible needs to be sitting in those chairs with the cameras on, explaining to the American people why they were deceived and why this deception was accomplished through incredible abuse of these powers.
That is the cathartic moment we need. And I sometimes debate the role that the Russia hoax played in the conflict that we currently find ourselves in Ukraine, in this proxy war. And I think NATO expansion without a real vision for NATO in the modern times is a contributing factor to what we're observing. And I also think that just when the Afghanistan war wound down, there was a place that the money launderers and weapons launderers needed another ecosystem to go and inhabit. And I do kind of think the winding down of Afghanistan and the winding up of our involvement in Ukraine are linked. But others have made the argument to me, and I don't know that I agree with this, but that what the Russia hoax did to kind of position Vladimir Putin as this villain trying to manipulate our elections somehow led us to this moment where we're more involved than we otherwise would be. Where do you fall on that, Glenn?
I absolutely believe that from the very beginning, my concern with RussiaGate as a journalist was that it was a evidence-free, baseless scandal. So obviously, as a journalist, I'm looking at this and saying this is false. That was my concern. My bigger concern, just as like kind of an American, a citizen of the world, whatever, is that there were a lot of people inside the Obama administration, people like Victoria Nuland and definitely Hillary Clinton, who believed that Russia needed to be confronted far more aggressively than Obama was willing to confront them. He didn't confront them in Syria. He didn't confront them, with the 2014 annexation of Ukraine. And he got criticized by the Hillary Clintons and Victoria Nulands of the world for not having done that. And they were determined to significantly raise the antagonism and hatred level among American people toward Russia by telling them, you know what, the reason you got Donald Trump is because of Vladimir Putin. He wants to end our democracy. He's a thug. He's a tyrant. And basically, when Mike Flynn got prosecuted for doing nothing other than picking up the phone and calling his counterpart in Russia to basically say, hey, we'd like to reset the relationship. Don't worry about these sanctions. We're going to try and have a better relationship. People became petrified of even talking to the Russians. Communication got cut off. And the United States and Russia are still the two largest nuclear powers on the planet. We have, thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles that are nuclear tipped, aimed at each other's cities on hair trigger warnings. To go to war against Russia, which is basically what we're doing in Ukraine, is incredibly dangerous. But I absolutely believe that one of the main reasons the public got on board to do it was because this endless propaganda about Vladimir Putin and RussiaGate and him taking over our democracy. And a lot of Republicans believe that as well. As you know, you worked with them. They were hardcore on funding the war in Ukraine. It wasn't just Democrats. And I think that was very much in the air, this idea that he got demonized. Russia got demonized. We had 15, 20 years of presidents saying, Putin is a shrewd, rational person. He acts in his self-interest. You can do a deal with him and trust him. And then overnight, it became, no, actually, he's the gravest danger to the United States. And a lot of older Americans still think of Russia as an enemy from the Cold War. And that propaganda really worked. And I do believe that's a major factor why we got into this now 4-year war with no end in sight in Russia and Ukraine.
It really has shifted, though. I remember when they initially did the sanctions package for Belarus and Russia, there were only 3 members who voted against that on the Republican side. Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and myself. And we went from that moment, the kind of low watermark of opposition to U.S. involvement in this conflict, to by the time I left, Glenn, half the Republican conference in every vote on this conflict was voting against continued U.S. investment and involvement. And I don't even know that these boomers in Congress came to that position out of anything other than political necessity. Because you had a lot of Republican primary voters out there who couldn't point to Ukraine on a map, didn't care, but they saw the inflationary effect of this. They saw, like you said, a country around them that was getting worse in terms of their own quality of life. And there was fatigue after Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And so I think that the worm has really turned on that. And what you don't hear anymore also is like this is what we have to do in the front lines of democracy. That was what always got me when, like, Biden or whomever, Jake Sullivan, would puff up, oh, for democracy. They canceled their presidential elections. They're lifting people off the streets and forcing them to fight. They're making elements of faith and media and political opposition illegal. And I'm thinking, what, this is the front lines of democracy? And now I see that U.S. policy is to have a 50% tariff on India as a secondary sanction because they buy stuff from Russia. So now, in defense of democracies that don't hold elections, that cancel the rights of media and opposition groups, we are literally creating an economic sanction against the biggest democracy in the world. Is that lost on everyone, Glenn?
That's incredibly of huge geostrategic importance. India is, I mean, it is shocking. But, I think one thing that is important is you are right that a lot of Republicans turned against it. There were maybe 6 dozen people on the first funding bill in the House Republican caucus who voted against it, you being one of them, obviously. And I think 11 Republican senators, and then that opposition grew. One of the things that I think is worth noting, and I think one of the major reasons that it happened was at the time, Tucker Carlson was in the 8 o'clock spot on Fox News. He was by far the most popular and watched cable news host in the country. And pretty much every night he was on TV ranting and raving about the stupidity and how nonsensical it is that we're sending billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine when obviously it's a war about who governs various provinces in eastern Ukraine. It has no bearing on the United States. And I remember when Tucker got fired from Fox, and I think part of it was that. A lot of Republicans, your colleagues, ran to like Axios and Politico anonymously and said, oh, we're so happy that Tucker got fired because now it's so much easier for us to fund the war in Ukraine like we want to. He was the one of many people, but he in particular making it so difficult. But, then again, here we are. We're now 7 months into the Trump presidency. I do absolutely believe that Trump wanted to and continues to want to end the war. And I do think that he's frustrated that Russia won't take his directions to stop, because Russia invested, they've lost hundreds of thousands of young Russian men. They've spent massive amounts of money. They've paid prices and sanctions and stuff. And they believe they have an existential national security interest in creating a buffer between themselves and NATO and themselves and the West. And they're not going to just stop because Trump tells them to. It's too important to Russia. But the current position is, and you never know if it's just Trump negotiating or not, is like, we're going to continue to fund Ukraine because we have to help them in this war. But I do think that's going to be a lot less than it was before. And a big part of that is, and this is what we began by talking about, the America First ideology was very much about this, like stop funding the wars of foreign countries. And I do think Trump and a lot of people in the White House and Congress very much want to stop it when it comes to Ukraine. They just don't apply the same mentality to Israel. But I think it was so important to get that message out there about Ukraine. Like, we need to stop sending all our money to these foreign wars. It's breaking our country, because that has helped with every instance where we're doing that. I think Trump was politically pressured not to bomb Iran for more than one night because he knew that his own base would revolt. These are all good things. These are all important and positive things. And so it just needs to keep being pushed. Like, we shouldn't send any more money to Ukraine. It's a futile war. They're going to lose. The reality is Russia is much bigger and more powerful. And that's just the reality. And we're just throwing, but also just one quick point, which is that the time that elapsed between our leaving Afghanistan and the war in Ukraine beginning was about 8 months. So the whole military industrial complex got to take a little break, got to breathe a little bit. And then right away, there was these huge contracts flowing in again for all their missiles and weapons and tanks and everything to send to Ukraine. It's obviously not a coincidence.
You know what's rare these days? A pharmacy that's actually on your side. I've been telling you all about the great All Family Pharmacy. They just dropped prices by up to 25% on 2 of their most requested medications, ivermectin and menbenzidol. Ivermectin now starts at just $2 per capsule. That's a big deal, especially if you need higher doses or just want to stock up. They're doing this because they believe people should have real access to the meds they want without jacked up prices or anyone getting in the way. You don't need insurance. Just go online and fill out a short form and a licensed doctor will review it. Once you get it approved, the meds ship right to your door. It's simple, secure, and it puts control back where it belongs. And that's with you. So they've got over 200 medications, and they're working to keep prices low. Go to allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt. Use code MATT10 to save an extra 10% off. That's allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt. Promo code MATT10. There is one other area of the world I want to discuss with you, Glenn, and it's one you cover closely. I've been covering it. It's what's happening in Brazil. And for those who don't know, Glenn was really one of the original reporters who showcased the corruption of the Lula administration, and probably one of the reasons why Lula had to face some consequences as a result of his conduct. But now you have Bolsonaro as this reemergent. I guess he never really went away, but certainly the popular support for Bolsonaro is palpable and noticeable. They want to arrest him. The United States has issued sanctions against Justice Moraes, the individual who's kind of acting like the dictator of Brazil. But at the same time, Lula seems to be more popular than ever because the retaliatory economic consequences that were applied to the whole country seem to have constituted some sort of base for Lula. So you have covered this extensively. What's going on in Brazil?
Yeah, just to quickly clarify, I did reporting in 2019 and 2020 about corruption inside the prosecutorial office that put Lula in jail, and then the Supreme Court used my reporting to let Lula out of jail. But then I did do reporting last year. We got this huge leak of documents from Moraes' office, the Supreme Court judge that has been censoring, imprisoning political opponents, putting them in exile, that showed massive abuses of power. Like, we had documents, it came right from his chambers by a very brave whistleblower. And we were able to show things like he would wake up one day and say, I want that magazine closed. Go find some evidence that would justify closing it. And they would come back and they would say, we looked everywhere. It doesn't seem like they did anything. It was like a right-wing pro-Bolsonaro magazine or website. And he would then send a message back saying, be creative. This is a person, I can't overstate what a tyrant he is. It's really like kind of a mental illness at this point. Like, he's so invested in his own righteousness and also in the determination to prove that his power is without limits, that he's actually quite maniacal. And there's a lot of people, including Lula. Yes, you're right. They got some benefits because Lula raised the sovereignty flag. Like, no one tells us what to do. Brazilians decide what Brazilians do. And of course, that's going to create some positive feelings toward Lula. It's like when any country gets attacked from an outside country, they unify behind their leader. The problem is that these tariffs and these sanctions are going to harm Brazil's economy very severely. And 14 and 15 months from now, when Lula runs for re-election, Bolsonaro is barred from running, but we'll see who he runs against. When people are suffering economically, when they've lost huge numbers of jobs because of tariffs and sanctions, and when, the economy starts crashing, no one's going to remember, oh yeah, I remember that Trump put sanctions or tariffs. They're going to blame the government. And Lula really wants to find a way out of this conflict with the United States and negotiate a deal, because he knows he's going to put him in trouble. The problem is that Moraes is a freak and a maniac, and he doesn't want a deal. He wants to blow up any deal. And so even, every time they do something, the tariffs or sanctions, he goes further. He is now at the point where he's ordering an American social media company, Rumble, to censor American citizens inside the United States, for ordering them to turn over data about American citizens in the United States and threatening Rumble with massive fines if they don't comply, which of course they're not going to. He's deliberately provoking the United States government, to show that he doesn't care. I was at first a little bit doubtful, even though I do think Moraes is a maniac. Like, why should the United States be interfering in Brazilian politics, punishing a judge because he's internally repressive? But I do think it becomes justified when that censorship, when those punishments start getting directed at American companies, American citizens, even legal residents in the United States, which he's been doing for months now. And it's kind of like Ukraine and Russia. In one sense, you can decide who you think is the just party, but at the end of the day, Russia is so much more powerful than Ukraine that they're going to win. The United States is infinitely more powerful than Brazil, with the dollar as the reserve currency, and Brazil can keep trying to pretend that they're willing to fight the United States. Lula will get a little popularity, raising the banner of sovereignty. But at the end of the day, this is a major crisis, a major problem in Brazil. We don't talk about it in the United States because it really doesn't affect the United States. But in Brazil, it's by far and away the most talked about issue is the conflict with the United States. So they're going to have to find ways out of that. This persecution of Bolsonaro is going to have to end. The censorship regime is going to have to end. Because if not, I know for sure that the United States government, the executive branch, tends to continue to crush Brazil the more defiant they become.
How long until we can accurately call Brazil a dictatorship?
I am very careful about, words like that. But at the same time, I'll just tell you, there are huge numbers of Bolsonaro supporters, journalists, elected members of Congress, senators, bloggers, activists who are either in prison because of Moraes, who ordered them in prison. They're all banned from the internet and censored. Huge numbers of them are in exile. And when they go into exile, when they leave Brazil, he tries to put them on the Interpol list. He tries to extradite them. The United States, even under Joe Biden, refused his extradition request because the United States said, no, these are political crimes. These are crimes of speech. We don't extradite for that. There's some in Spain. The Spanish government also told Moraes, we're not extraditing. And then in retaliation, he actually released a drug dealer that Spain wants extradited, kind of as punishment. He asked Interpol to put Bolsonaro supporters on the list. Interpol said, this is not appropriate. These are not the kind of crimes that we're here to govern. And everybody I know in Brazil is afraid of him, is afraid of speaking out against him. I mean, I do it because I feel like I have a lot of extra protection being American, having a big, profile internationally. And some other people do it too. But when you get to that point where people are genuinely petrified of criticizing a government official, and for good reason, that you end up in jail, you end up having your life destroyed. He freezes people's bank accounts, their assets, and there's so many people in exile. You do get to the point where I think you can say Brazil is under judicial tyranny or judicial dictatorship, even though I'm very hesitant to use words like that. But we're getting to the point, if we're not already there, where it's appropriate.
Glenn Greenwald, he is the host of System Update on Rumble, someone I follow closely when he speaks about matters of the world and access to information. I always get a lot smarter every time we have a chance to chat, and greatly appreciate you coming on the show.
It's always great to see you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Want to see more great videos like this? Click on the link below to subscribe to OAN Live and watch Dan Ball's Real America and The Matt Gaetz Show on Dish Channel 212. Tune in, subscribe, and watch today.